we have been discussing the paper Introduction to Philosophy, which is introduced for the semester 1 students UGCF NEP syllabus for the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. We continue discussing this paper today in our Unit 4, which is entitled as The Social Contract Theory, Justice and the Scientific Rigor. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, the first thing when we try to understand what social contract is, we see that from Thomas Hobbes to J.J. Rousseau and John Locke, the social contract frames political legitimacy as arising from rational agreements. It is not merely historical but normative. It asks what justifies authority. Similarly, about justice, we can see that it evolves from classical distributive frameworks to modern fairness-based theories like Rawls' justice as fairness and critiques from Amartya Sen's emphasizing realizations over ideal institutions. And about scientific temper, which has been popularized in India by Nehru and philosophically deepened by D.P. Chattopadhyay, scientific temper is not just method but an ethical disposition where skepticism, openness, rational critique and freedom from dogma are encouraged. Today, we would be discussing the convergences or a shared relational ethos amongst these three concepts. At a deeper level, all these three are grounded in rational accountability. The social contract is legitimacy through rational consent. Justice is fairness through reasoned principles. Scientific temper, truth through critical inquiry. Now, what we see is these three converge on what Duncan Pritchard might call an epistemic virtue framework. Justification, trust, and rational responsibility. Institutions, academic or political, require epistemic trust to function. As much as we have seen the convergence, we would also like to see the divergence. And let's talk now about the tensions and critiques here. The social contract theories, especially Rawls, are often idealized. They assume rational, equal agents. Justice in practice, as Sen argues, must deal with actual inequalities and lived injustices. Scientific temper, while ideal, is unevenly distributed due to socio-cultural conditioning. There is a gap between normative rationality and empirical reality. Chattopadhyay critiques these by emphasizing historicity of reason. Reason is socially embedded, not abstracted. Now, when we talk about power and exclusion, we see that feminist and post-colonial critiques show that classical social contracts excluded women, colonized peoples. Justice frameworks risk becoming procedural rather than transformative. Scientific temper can become technocratic elitism if divorced from social contexts. Thus, scientific temper must be democratized, otherwise it reproduces epistemic hierarchies. Now, drawing from Pritchard's epistemology and broader debates, we see that there is a debate vis-a-vis the testimonial injustice, the voices not trusted, and hermeneutical gaps lack of interpretative resources. Justice is not distributive, it is epistemic. Academia must recognize marginalized knowledges. The ideal academic space we should be mentioning here is that an academic institution should be a mini social contract with shared norms, mutual respect, a site of justice where there is fair evolution and inclusion, and of course a space of scientific temperament where there is the domain of critical inquiry and debate. However, hierarchies suppresses dissent, breaks scientific temper. There is biasness in evaluation, and that violates justice. There is a lack of dialogue. It weakens the contract. So, knowledge practice requires intellectual virtue, which is to do with honesty, humility, and openness. Now, when we talk about the democratic society, we see that the social contract is nothing but legitimacy of the state. Justice is welfare, rights, and equity. Scientific temper is informed citizen. In the Indian context, with D.P. Chattopadhyay, linking scientific temper to civilizational self-reflection, we see it is not Western import but rooted in Indian philosophical traditions like the Nyayas and the Buddhists' logic. Essential for resisting superstition, authoritarianism. Scientific temper becomes a moral, political duty, not just cognitive style. Now, we can imagine a triangular model here where with social contract, which is to do with the normative foundation, and then we have justice as the ethical goal and scientific temperament as the epistemic method, each correcting the other. So, if scientific temperament prevents dogmatic contracts, justice ensures contracts are fair, and social contract institutionalizes both. Thus, the real challenge is not theorizing but integration. A society may have a constitution which is contract without justice, and it may pursue science without ethical responsibility. It may speak of justice without rational critique. The deeper problem is that modern institutions suffer from fragmentation of reason. Political reason is the contract, moral reason, justice, and scientific reason, truth. Thinkers like Pritchard and Chattopadhyay implicitly urge us towards epistemic integration, a culture where knowing, valuing, and governing are not disjoint. It is in fact critical that these three features of knowing, valuing, and governing are structured in an epistemic pyramid. So, we see that to truly connect, converge, dissect, and discuss these three ideas, we must recognize that a just society is not only that which is fairly governed, but one that thinks well, questions deeply, and includes all voices in its shared reasoning. Thus, the three foundational pillars of modern thought can definitely and without any hesitation be said to be those of the social contract, political legitimacy, justice, moral fairness, and scientific temper, epistemic rationality. So, the question that remains then is how do these frameworks collectively shape our academia and democratic life. Please understand that, as told several times, in philosophy, our job is not to come up with answers. Our job is not to fill up the gaps. Our job is to critically investigate. Our job is to question. As very often said, that the day we stop thinking, day we stop critically analyzing things, the day we stop critiquing, the laboratory of the so-called philosophy would shut down. Going ahead about the social contract theory, the classical foundational stones of this theory was laid by philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau and others. With Thomas Hobbes, he was very clear about the state of nature, and this state of nature, he had said, has absolutely been violent and insecure, where there is a war of all against all. And he says that the way out to minimize this is through a social contract. This contract would ultimately lead to the submission to sovereign authority. The aim of such a law for Thomas Hobbes was security over freedom. Similarly, with John Locke, we see that the state of nature has been relatively peaceful. The natural rights like life, liberty, and property have been maintained. The contract, however, was essential for protection of these natural rights and also the right to revolt. Rousseau emphasizes on general will. There is a collective sovereignty there, freedom through participation. There we see that legitimacy arises from consent. Individuals are seen as rational agents, and normative is not historical, but it is a general framework. Some of the critiques are that we find in this such a social contract theory is that many a times it ignores inequalities. It is because it is abstract and idealized. Secondly, such social contract theories ends up being exclusion of the marginalized groups, and also it assumes a rational consensus where conflict persists. Now, when we talk about the theory of justice from the modern frameworks, we see there is the presence of John Rawls. For Rawls, justice is seen as fairness, and he talks about the veil of ignorance. Here, there are basically two principles that one ought to take note of, which is equal basic liberties and difference principles, which benefits the least advantage. Similarly, with Amartya Sen, there is the focus on capabilities. Justice is realization, not just ideal structure. It is comparative, not transcendental. When we go ahead with the dimensions of justice, we see that it is distributive, where resources are or ought to be distributive. The procedural has to be the fair processes, and the epistemic has to be fairness in knowledge practices. The critiques, Rawls, for example, his theory has been considered too idealistic. Amartya Sen's theory again is critiqued that it lacks institutional precision, and justice often is reduced to policy, ignoring lived realities. Now, coming to scientific temperament, we understand that this conceptual understanding of this concept was promoted in India largely by Nehru, and it has philosophically it was deepened by D.P. Chattopadhyay. The core elements of these scientific temperament has been the rational inquiry, skepticism towards dogma, openness to evidence, critical thinking, and ethical responsibility in knowledge. Chattopadhyay's perspective is interesting to note here. For him, scientific temperament is culturally rooted, and it is not purely Western. It is linked to Indian traditions like Nyaya and Buddhist logic, and it emphasizes historicity of reason. We also see that the critiques such as of Chattopadhyay's perspective of the scientific temperament is also very well noted, where one questions if can it become the technocratic elitism, uneven access to rational education, where one may ignore the emotional or the ethical dimensions if narrowly defined. These are some of the concerns that hovers around scientific temper. Now, when we talk about the readings as prescribed in this unit, we see that for Duncan Pritchard, for him, knowledge should involve justification, truth, and the anti-lack conditions. The relevance, he says that institutions ought to rely on epistemic trust, and scientific temper requires intellectual virtues, which is to do with honesty, open-mindedness, and intellectual courage. If we look at the PPT here, which is being displayed, we see that the convergence of these three frameworks. The first is the concept, the core idea, followed by the function. We see that the concept of the social contract, the core idea is rational agreement. The function is political legitimacy. Similarly, with justice, we find that the core idea is fairness and the function is ethical distribution. Further, with scientific temperament, the core idea is rational inquiry and the function is epistemic validity. So, the convergence point of these three frameworks are that all rely on reason, all require accountability, and all aim at collective well-being. Now, if we are to talk about the application of the same in the world of academia, we see that the social contract, for example, the shared norms in the academic integrity is there. In justice, of course, vis-a-vis the fair evaluation, inclusivity and others, we find justice being pronounced in the world of academia. And about scientific temperament, of course, the critical inquiry and debate further paves the way. However, there are challenges. Hierarchical power structures, biasness in assessment, suppression of dissent, and epistemic injustice, where there has been the marginalized voices ignored. In epistemic justice, we see that there is the equal recognition of diverse knowledges. There can be inclusive curriculum and, of course, dialogical pedagogy. Now, if we are to talk about these three frameworks of application beyond academia, we see that the same can be entrusted in a democratic society where social contract is seen as legitimacy of governance, justice as rights, welfare, equity, and scientific temper as informed citizenship. In the Indian context, scientific temper is considered as constitutional duty. Chattopadhyay, of course, synthesizes the tradition and modernity of the scientific temperament. Now, if we further see some of the critical synthesis of these three frameworks, we see that the tensions are real. What are these tensions? The tensions are between ideal versus real. Whatever justice or social contract or scientific temperament is ideally conceptualized, how much of it is there in the real world? It is again between reasoning versus power. Again, universal versus contextual. So, the integrated model which has been established of social contract, justice and scientific temperament, we can look at this model from the lens of institutional framework, moral goal and method of critique. Thus, a society cannot be just unless it is rational, and it cannot be rational unless it is justly structured. So, a society is based on rationality, and that is in turn based on being justly structured. Thus, these frameworks are interdependent. Social contract without justice is oppression. Justice without scientific temperament is dogmatic, and scientific temperament without justice is elitism. The goal is epistemic moral integration in both academia and society. Now, there are some deeper questions that one should take note of, just like the question that should be coming to us at this time is, can social contract theory account for historical injustices? Is Rawls' theory practical in unequal societies? How can scientific temper be democratized? What is the role of epistemic justice in education? Can Indian philosophical traditions enrich scientific temper? The question thus, for example, can social contract theory account for historical injustices? This very question cuts to the very limits of modern philosophy. At stake is whether a framework built on hypothetical consent among rational equals can meaningfully address real histories of domination, exclusion, and structured violence. Further, when we talk about some of the classical problems, we would see that thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, the state of nature, many condemn it as a fictional starting point. The contract is hypothetical, not historical, and the individuals are assumed to be free, equal, and rational. So, the philosophical tension here is that the historical injustice of colonialism, caste hierarchies, slavery, patriarchy are non-consensual, structured, embedded, and persisting across generations. Therefore, classical social contract theory appears conceptually incapable of explaining how unjust histories arise, because it begins from a morally equal baseline that never existed. We would be continuing more of the problems associated with this framework in our next class. Thank you so much.